The Japanese destroyer's searchlight swept across the water like the finger of death. Missing our bow by mere feet, we held our breath engines cut to idle drifting in the darkness off Vela La Vela 23. American sailors pressed against the deck of PT-164, trying to become invisible. In the cargo holds of the 3 Japanese transports behind that destroyer, nearly 8,000 enemy soldiers sat unaware that their journey to reinforce Kolombangara was about to end in the black waters of the Solomon Sea. The date was July 19, 1943, and in exactly 4 minutes we would unleash hell from the shadows. My hands gripped the twin .50 caliber mount so tightly my knuckles ached. Beside me, Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg whispered coordinates to our skipper, Lieutenant Commander Arthur M. McPhersonson. The green phosphorescent glow of our compass was the only light we dared show. Behind us, hidden in the moon's shadow cast by Vela La Vela's volcanic peaks, PT-168 and PT-171 waited for our signal. We were America's secret weapons, and the Japanese Navy was about to discover why darkness was no longer their ally. My name is Chief Petty Officer Thomas Tom Harrigan, United States Navy Reserve, and I was one of the first to prove that small wooden boats could sink steel warships. People often ask me what it was like being part of the most closely guarded naval secret of 1943. The truth is, we were too busy trying not to die to think about making history. We only knew that if we failed tonight, those 8,000 Japanese soldiers would reach Kolombangara, where they would slaughter American boys trying to take that strategic airfield. Every torpedo we carried represented hundreds of American lives that might be saved. Every enemy transport we sent to the bottom meant parents back home who wouldn't receive that dreaded telegram from the War Department. To understand how 3 boats smaller than most private yachts could challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its power, you need to understand what we were up against in the summer of 1943. The Japanese had turned night fighting into an art form. Since their victory at Savo Island the previous August, where they sank 4 Allied cruisers without losing a ship, they owned the darkness in the Solomon Islands. Their sailors trained for years in night combat, learning to fight without radar, using only keen eyesight and practice coordination. They called their nighttime supply runs the Tokyo Express, and we called them the Rat Run. Either way, they moved troops and supplies with near impunity once the sun went down. The American Navy had bigger ships, better radar, and more firepower. But we were losing the night war. Our admirals, trained in the traditional battle line tactics of Jutland and Manila Bay, couldn't adapt quickly enough to this new kind of warfare. Our cruisers and destroyers, designed for fleet actions in open ocean, were sitting ducks in the confined waters of the Solomons. We needed something different, something the Japanese wouldn't expect. That something was being built in secret boatyards from New Orleans to New York, and it would revolutionize naval warfare forever. The PT Boat Patrol torpedo boat was born from desperation and American ingenuity. At 80 feet long and 20 foot wide, they were constructed from laminated mahogany plywood, not steel. 3. Packard 51, 12 engines, modified versions of the Liberty aircraft engine, pushed them to speeds over 45 knots faster than any torpedo or conventional warship. We carried 4 21-inch torpedo tubes with Mark 13 torpedoes, a 20mm Aerocon cannon, 450 caliber machine guns, and enough ammunition to raise hell for about 15 minutes of sustained combat. After that, we better be heading home or heading to the bottom. I first saw a PT boat in February 1943 at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's training center in Melville, Rhode Island. I was a destroyer sailor fresh from convoy duty in the North Atlantic when the Navy asked for volunteers for hazardous duty with experimental vessels. The recruiter wouldn't tell us what these vessels were, only that the casualty rate was expected to be over 50%. Out of 200 volunteers, they selected 40. I made the cut because I could navigate by stars and had small boat experience from growing up on Chesapeake Bay. The first time I stepped aboard PT-164, I thought the Navy had lost its mind. This wasn't a warship. It was a glorified speedboat with delusions of grandeur. The hull was wood in a war of steel and armor. The living quarters were so cramped that hot bunking wasn't just common, it was mandatory. There was no armor protection except for some sheet metal around the bridge. One good hit from anything larger than a rifle bullet, and we'd be matchsticks floating on the water. But then I met MC Fersenson, and everything changed. Mac was 28 years old, ancient by PT boat standards, with eyes that had seen too much already. He'd been at Pearl Harbor aboard the destroyer USS Shore when the Japanese attack had fought at Midway and volunteered for PT boats because, in his words, "I'm tired of being a target. Time to become the hunter." Mac understood something that would take the rest of us weeks to learn. PT boats weren't meant to fight like conventional warships. We were maritime guerrillas, seagoing assassins who struck from ambush and vanished before the enemy could react. Our crew was a collection of misfits and specialists who'd never have served together on a regular Navy vessel. Dutch Vanderberg, our executive officer, was a Yale mathematics professor who could calculate torpedo firing solutions in his head faster than most men could work a slide rule. Chief motor machinist's mate. Carlos, Charlie Mendoza, had been building racing engines in Los Angeles before the war and could make our temperamental Packards purr like kittens or roar like lions depending on what we needed. Radio man, second class, William Sparks Patterson, came from the submarine service where he'd learned to operate radios in absolute silence. Our torpedo man gunners made first class. Patrick "Paddy" O'Brien was an artist with those mechanical fish. Each Mark 13 torpedo weighed 200 and cost as much as a house back home. Paddy treated them better than most men treated their wives, constantly adjusting cleaning and sweet-talking them. "These beauties," he'd say while polishing the bronze propellers, "are the only reason the Japs will take us seriously. One shot, one kill, or we're just expensive target practice." The rest of our 12-man crew included 2 more gunners, an engineer, a cook who doubled as a medic, and 3 seamen who did everything else. We were blacks and whites city boys and farm kids, high school dropouts and college graduates, united by one simple fact. We were all volunteers who'd signed up knowing we probably wouldn't survive the war. Training at Melville was brutal and unforgiving. The Navy had learned from early PT boat losses that enthusiasm wasn't enough. We needed to be faster, smarter, and more vicious than anything the Japanese could throw at us. We practiced high-speed attacks until we could launch torpedoes accurately while bouncing across waves at 40 knots. We learned to navigate by sound and instinct when tropical squalls reduced visibility to 0. Most importantly, we learned to think like pirates rather than sailors. Commander James Wild Jim Patterson, who ran the training program, had survived the Philippines campaign and escaped Corridor on one of the last PT boats out. He had a simple training philosophy. The Japanese expect you to fight fair. Don't. They expect you to follow naval tradition. Don't. They expect you to be afraid of the dark. Make them afraid instead. He taught us that our greatest weapons weren't our torpedoes, but surprise speed and sheer audacity. We arrived at our forward base at Renova on June 30th, 1943, just as the invasion of New Georgia was beginning. The base was nothing more than a fuel dump, some camouflage Quonset huts, and a rough dock hidden under palm fronds. The first thing we noticed was the smell-rotting vegetation diesel fuel and the sweet stench of tropical decay. The second thing was the sound of artillery fire from New Georgia, where Marines were dying to take the Munda airfield. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9. Our unit consisted of 12 PT boats tasked with interdicting Japanese reinforcement attempts in the Central Solomons. Our mission sounded simple: patrol the waters between the major Japanese bases and sink anything flying the rising sun. The reality was far more complex. These waters were a maze of coral reefs, volcanic islands, and hidden Japanese strongpoints. The enemy had seaplanes for reconnaissance coast watchers on every major island and destroyer squadrons specifically trained to hunt PT boats. Our first patrol on July 5th was a disaster. 3 boats, including ours, attempted to intercept a Japanese convoy near Visu Visu. We were spotted by an enemy float plane before we could get into attack position. And suddenly 4 destroyers were bearing down on us with searchlights blazing and guns firing. We scattered like rabbits racing through a gauntlet of shell splashes. PT-158 took a direct hit from a 5-inch shell and disintegrated. 12 men gone in an instant, blown to fragments along with their boat. We spent 4 hours dodging through reefs and islands before finally escaping. No torpedoes fired, no enemy ships damaged, and we'd lost a boat and crew. That night, huddled in our base at Renovamac, gathered us together. "We learned something important today," he said quietly. "We can't fight them like destroyers fight each other. We're not built for gun duels. We strike from ambush or we don't strike at all." It was a hard lesson paid for in blood, but it would shape every mission that followed. Over the next 2 weeks, we developed new tactics through trial and error. We learned to use the island's radar shadows to mask our approach. We discovered that shutting down 2 engines and running on 1 reduced our noise signature dramatically. Most importantly, we figured out how to coordinate attacks between multiple boats using simple light signals that the Japanese couldn't intercept. The intelligence network supporting us was remarkable. Australian coast watchers hiding in the hills of Japanese-occupied islands would radio enemy ship movements. Native Solomon Islanders risking execution if caught would paddle their canoes out to meet us with information about Japanese positions. Sometimes we'd get decrypt intelligence from Pearl Harbor giving us exact convoy schedules, but most of the time we hunted by instinct and experience. The PT boats were still classified as secret weapons in July 1943. Official Navy communications never mentioned us by name, referring only to small craft or mosquito boats. The Japanese knew something was hitting their convoys, but their initial reports described us as submarines or mines. They couldn't believe the Americans would send wooden speedboats against steel warships. That ignorance was our greatest advantage. On the night of July 18th, Coast Watcher reporting indicated a major Japanese reinforcement convoy would run through Blackett Strait, heading for VA on Kolombangara. This was the target we'd been waiting for. Multiple transports with minimal escort forced to pass through narrow waters where their superior numbers wouldn't help them. Mac volunteered our boat to lead the attack along with PT-168, skippered by Lieutenant Henry Hank Bramwell, and PT-171, under Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph Joey Antonelli. The briefing that evening was tense. Intelligence estimated 3 large transports escorted by 1 or 2 destroyers carrying elements of the Japanese 13th Regiment elite troops who'd fought in China and the Philippines. These weren't construction battalions or supply troops. These were frontline soldiers who would make our Marines' lives hell on New Georgia. Commander William Bill Specht, our squadron leader, made it clear, "Gentlemen, this convoy cannot reach VA. I don't care if you have to ram those transports. They go to the bottom tonight." As the sun set on July 19th, painting the sky blood red over the Solomons, we made our final preparations. Patty O'Brien ran through his torpedo checklist for the 5th time, setting the Mark 13s for a depth of 10 feet and the speed for 28 knots, optimal settings for hitting a loaded transport. Charlie Mendoza had our engines tuned to perfection mufflers installed to reduce noise. Dutch Vanderberg plotted and replotted our attack approach, calculating currents, wind, and the moon's position. I checked my machine guns one last time, ensuring the ammunition belts fed smoothly. We loaded nothing but armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Regular ball ammunition was useless against steel ships, but API rounds could penetrate bridge windows, start fires, and suppress enemy gun crews. Every 5th round was a tracer, creating lines of fire that looked like deadly fireworks in the night sky. At 20-30 hours, we slipped our moorings and headed into the gathering darkness. The 3 boats moved in column formation, engines muffled to a low rumble. As we cleared Renover Harbor, Mac ordered us to test weapons. The night erupted briefly in gunfire as 12 machine guns and 3 20mm cannons barked into the empty sea. Then silence again, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of our engines and the hiss of water along our hulls. The ocean was rougher than we'd hoped, with a 2-foot chop that would make torpedo accuracy challenging. But it also meant our wakes would be harder to spot, and the wave action would mask our engine noise. Every advantage mattered when you were 80 feet of plywood attacking 400 feet of steel. By 2300 hours, we reached our ambush position off the north coast of Vella La Vella. Mac cut engines to idle, and we drifted in the darkness, waiting. The only sounds were water lapping against our hull and the distant rumble of artillery from New Georgia. Then at 23:47 hours, Sparks Patterson picked up a transmission from Coast Watcher reporting, Three large ships, two escorts bearing 280 speed, 18 knots, range 15 mi from your position. The hunt was on. Mac started two engines, keeping them at low throttle as we moved to intercept. The mathematics were simple but crucial. The enemy convoy was making 18 knots on a steady course. We could make 35 knots without creating too much wake. If we positioned ourselves correctly, we'd intercept them just as they entered the narrowest part of Blackett Strait, where they'd have no room to maneuver. At 00:18 hours on July 20th, Dutch spotted them through his binoculars, dark shapes against the star field exactly where they should be. The Japanese were maintaining perfect formation, two destroyers in the lead, three transports following with another destroyer bringing up the rear. They showed no lights, but their size and regular spacing made them easy to track once you knew where to look. Mac's plan was elegantly simple and incredibly dangerous. PT-168 would attack from the port side, PT-171 from starboard, while we went straight up the middle after the lead transport. It meant passing between the escort destroyers, literally threading the needle between death on either side, but if it worked, we'd cause maximum confusion and have clear shots at all three transports. "All ahead slow," Mac whispered. We crept forward at 5 knots, barely moving, letting the convoy come to us. At 2,000 watt, we could hear their engines, the deep thrumming of massive diesels pushing thousands of tons through the water. At 1,500 Basisi solid, we could see individual details. The pagod-style bridge of the lead destroyer, the cargo booms on the transports, even figures moving on deck. At 1,000 Yid, Mac gave the signal. 3 clicks on the radio, and all 3 PT boats surged forward simultaneously. Our engines roared from idle to full throttle in seconds, lifting our bow out of the water as we accelerated to attack speed. The night shattered as we raced toward the enemy convoy at 40 knots, 3 small craft challenging steel giants. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Their lookouts, trained to spot submarines or approaching destroyers, never expected attackers moving this fast from this close. We were inside their formation before they could react, racing between the escort destroyers at point-blank range. I opened fire with my twin 50s, raking the bridge of the nearest destroyer, seeing my traces punch through windows and ricochet off steel. Fire 1, fire 2. Patty launched our first 2 Mark 13 torpedoes at 600 yard, impossibly close range where missing was almost impossible. The mechanical fish leaped from their tubes and splashed into the water, their props already spinning at full speed. Twin wakes of phosphorescent bubbles stret, a converted passenger liner carrying over 3,000 Japanese soldiers. The destroyer to our starboard finally reacted, swinging its searchlight toward us. The brilliant white beam found us instantly, blinding in its intensity. Immediately, their 25mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Green traces reaching out for us like deadly fingers. Shells splashed around us so close that spray soaked everyone on deck. Then our torpedoes hit. The first struck the transport just after the bridge with a thunderous explosion that lit up the night like lightning. The second hit amidship, breaking the ship's back instantly. The 8,000-ton vessel lifted partially out of the water, then split in half, both sections immediately beginning to sink. Through the searchlight glare and gunfire, we could see hundreds of Japanese soldiers spilling into the water, their screams audible even over our engines. PT-168 struck next, both Mark 13 torpedoes slamming into the second transport. That ship, loaded with ammunition and fuel for the VA garrison, exploded like a volcano. The blast was so powerful it knocked me off my feet, and a wave of superheated air washed over our boat. Flaming debris rained down around us, starting small fires on our wooden deck that we frantically stomped out. The Japanese destroyers were responding now, but they faced an impossible problem. We were too close for their main guns to depress low enough to hit us, and we were mixed in with their own transports, making it dangerous for them to fire. Their solution was to try ramming us using their superior size to simply run us down. The nearest destroyer turned hard toward us, its knife bow aimed directly at our beam. At the combined closure speed, we had maybe 10 seconds before impact. Mac threw the wheel hard right and pushed the throttles past their stops. Our engines screamed in protest, but we pivoted like a ballet dancer, missing the destroyer's bow by less than 10 feet. As we passed, I emptied a full belt of ammunition into their bridge at point-blank range, seeing sparks fly as bullets struck home. PT-171 wasn't as lucky. Joey Antonelli had lined up perfect shots on the third transport, but a Japanese destroyer caught them with searchlights before they could fire. The enemy's 25mm cannons found their mark stitching a line of holes across PT-171's bow. One shell hit a torpedo, but miraculously it didn't detonate. The warhead needed to be armed by spinning in water before it would explode. Still, Joey had to abort his attack run and flee streaming smoke and taking on water. We came around for another pass, but the element of surprise was gone. Every searchlight in the Japanese convoy was now sweeping the water, and guns of every caliber were firing in all directions. The water around us was torn by so many shell splashes it looked like a rainstorm. Worse, the Japanese had finally gotten their 5-in guns into action, and those could blow us to splinters with a single hit. "Launch remaining fish and get us out of here," Max shouted over the den. Patty fired our last 2 Mark 13 torpedoes at the remaining transport, but the ship's captain saw them coming and managed to comb the wakes, turning parallel so both torpedoes passed harmlessly along his sides. Then we were running all 3 engines at maximum power, weaving between shell splashes as we fled into the darkness. Behind us, the battle continued to rage. PT-168, despite taking several hits, managed to put 1 more torpedo into the already sinking second transport. The ammunition ship's death throes illuminated the entire strait's secondary explosions rippling through her hull as she went down. 2 of the 3 transports were gone, taking nearly 6,000 Japanese soldiers with them. The third transport and the destroyers were undamaged but thoroughly shaken. We regrouped 5 mi south of the engagement area, all 3 boats battered but still afloat. PT-171 was in the worst shape with multiple holes at the waterline and 1 engine out. We came alongside and helped transfer wounded crew members while our carpenter's mates worked frantically to plug holes with everything from mattresses to life jackets. PT-168 had lost her radio antenna and taken shrapnel damage throughout her superstructure but remained combat capable. Our boat had somehow escaped with minimal damage. Some shrapnel holes, a burned-out gun barrel from overheating, and scorch marks from near misses. But we were alive and we'd accomplished our mission. 2 transports definitely sunk, thousands of enemy soldiers killed, and the Japanese reinforcement schedule disrupted. The surviving transport, rather than continue to reverse course and headed back to Rabaul. The journey back to base was tense. Japanese float planes were up at first light searching for us. We hid in the shadow of small islands camouflaged with palm fronds engines, off barely breathing as enemy aircraft droned overhead. It took us 14 hours to cover what should have been a 3-hour journey, but we all made it back to Renova. The debriefing was exhaustive. Intelligence officers wanted every detail: Japanese tactics, weapon effectiveness, enemy response times. What we told them would be distributed to every PT squadron in the Pacific. The lessons learned from our engagement would save American lives and sink enemy ships throughout the remaining war years. But the immediate impact was even more significant. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese communications describing new American secret weapons and high-speed torpedo boats appearing from nowhere. For the first time, the Imperial Navy was afraid of the dark. They could no longer move freely at night, couldn't guarantee safe passage even to their most heavily guarded convoys. Every shadow might hide a PT boat. Every sound might be American engines approaching. Over the following weeks, the Japanese changed their entire resupply strategy. Convoys grew larger but less frequent. Destroyer escorts doubled, then tripled. They started using searchlight-equipped float planes for night reconnaissance. All of these changes meant fewer supplies and reinforcements reaching their island garrisons, giving our ground forces crucial advantages. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the tactical success. Japanese soldiers waiting for reinforcement that never came began to lose hope. Enemy commanders, unable to guarantee supply deliveries, had to cancel offensive operations. The myth of Japanese invincibility at night, shattered by wooden boats crewed by American teenagers and reservists, began to crumble throughout the Pacific. Our squadron's success led to rapid expansion of the PT boat program. New bases were established throughout the Solomons and New Guinea. Improved boats with better engines, radar, and armor protection were rushed into production. Tactics we developed through trial and error became official doctrine taught at training bases from Rhode Island to California. The cost of this success was measured in friends who didn't come home. 2 weeks after our successful attack, PT-164 hit a mine while returning from patrol. All hands lost. PT-162 was caught by Japanese destroyers in daylight when engine failure left her dead in the water. They shot her to pieces. Only 3 survivors were pulled from the water. Joey Antonelli, skipper of PT-171, was killed by a sniper while his boat was refueling at a forward base. By October 1943, when I was rotated back to the States for new construction training, our squadron had lost 7 boats and 73 men, but we'd sunk or damaged over 40 Japanese vessels from destroyers to barges and killed thousands of enemy soldiers who never reached their destinations. The exchange rate was brutal but necessary. Every PT boat we lost was replaceable. The Japanese ships and experienced crews were not. I returned to the Pacific in March 1944 as executive officer of PT-321 operating in the Philippines. The boats were better, radar armor plate around the cockpit, more reliable torpedoes, but the essence remained the same: speed, surprise, and audacity. We were still proving that American innovation could overcome any enemy advantage. The Japanese never fully adapted to the PT boat threat. They tried everything: specialized hunter-killer groups, radar-equipped destroyers, even suicide boats designed to ram us. But they couldn't be everywhere. Couldn't protect every convoy, couldn't make the night safe again. The secret weapon they discovered too late had permanently changed the balance of power in the Pacific. M. McPherson survived the war, earning a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars. He stayed in the Navy, eventually commanding a destroyer squadron in Korea. We kept in touch until his death in 1987. At his funeral, his son told me Mac often said the PT boats were where he learned what real courage meant. Not the absence of fear, but action despite terror. Dutch Vanderberg returned to Yale after the war, but never forgot his navigation lessons learned in the Solomons. He became one of America's leading oceanographers, using skills honed dodging Japanese destroyers to map ocean currents and underwater mountains. He once told me that after threading between enemy warships at 40 knots in the dark, everything else seemed easy. Charlie Mendoza went back to building racing engines in Los Angeles, applying tricks learned keeping PT boat engines running to make cars go faster. His garage became legendary among hot rodders with a sign that read "Speed Shop." We made PT boats fly. He'd tell customers that if he could make 400 to 500 horsepower push 50 tons at 45 knots, he could make anything go fast. Patty O'Brien stayed in the Navy, becoming one of the service's leading torpedo experts. He wrote the manual on Mark 13 torpedo maintenance that was used until the 1970s, but he never forgot those torpedoes we fired that night off Vela La Vela. "Those were my fish that sank those transports," he'd say with pride. 2 shots, 2 hits, 6,000 Japanese who never made it to kill Americans. The PT boat story is often overshadowed by the bigger battles of World War II, Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf. But for those of us who served on these tiny wooden warriors, we knew we'd been part of something revolutionary. We'd proven that technology and courage could overcome tradition and size. We'd shown that American sailors, many of whom had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor, could outfight the best Navy in the world at their own game. The secret of our success wasn't really the boats themselves, though they were marvels of engineering. It wasn't our torpedoes, though. When they worked, they were devastating. The real secret was the American spirit of innovation, the willingness to try something completely different when conventional methods failed. While our admirals initially dismissed PT boats as toys, junior officers and enlisted men proved that toys with teeth could change the course of a war. Every time I read about modern naval warfare, missile boats, stealth technology, asymmetric warfare, I see the legacy of those PT boats. We proved that naval combat didn't have to be about battleships slugging it out at 20,000 feet. It could be about speed and stealth, about hitting where the enemy didn't expect and disappearing before they could respond. Every fast attack craft in today's Navy carries DNA from those plywood speedboats that terrorized the Japanese Navy. The Japanese phrase that entered their naval vocabulary in 1943 was simply mosquito boat terror, a fear that spread throughout their fleet. Post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers revealed that PT boats caused disruption far beyond our actual numbers. They had to assume we were everywhere, had to plan for attacks that might never come, had to waste resources defending against threats that might be shadows. Admiral Tanaka Riso, who commanded many of the Tokyo Express runs, wrote after the war, "The American PT boats were our worst nightmare, submarines we could hunt with depth charges, aircraft we could see coming. But these devil boats appeared from nowhere, struck like cobras, and vanished into the night. They made us afraid of our own element, the darkness we had once ruled. That fear, that uncertainty we created was worth more than any number of ships sunk." It represented the turning point when the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, began to doubt itself. When sailors who had trained their entire lives for night combat started fearing shadows, the psychological battle was already won. The technical evolution of PT boats during the war was remarkable. The early boats like ours were essentially peacetime designs pressed into combat service. By 1945, PT boats carried radar rockets, advanced torpedoes, and even primitive guided missiles. But the core concept never changed: small, fast, deadly, and crewed by volunteers willing to take insane risks for their country. One story that captures the PT boat spirit happened in October 1944 during the Battle of Lee Gulf. A squadron of PT boats, hopelessly outgunned, attacked the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. Their torpedoes couldn't even penetrate Yamato's armor belt, but they attacked anyway, forcing the massive battleship to take evasive action and buying time for American escort carriers to escape. Small boats didn't sink the giant that day, but their courage saved American lives. The PT boat bases themselves became legends: Renova, Tulagi, Mios, Wendy, exotic names that meant mosquitoes, malaria, and midnight missions. These weren't Pearl Harbor or San Diego with their officers' clubs and clean sheets. These were muddy hellholes where we lived on Spam and cigarettes, where mail took months to arrive, where the only entertainment was poker and rumors. But morale remained high because we knew we were making a difference. The natives of the Solomon Islands deserve special recognition. They risked everything to help us, guiding us through reefs, rescuing downed airmen and shipwrecked sailors, providing intelligence on Japanese movements. Many were executed when caught helping Americans. Their courage and sacrifice were essential to our success. Without their help, we would have been blind and lost in those island mazes. The coast watchers, those lonely volunteers hiding on Japanese-occupied islands with radios and binoculars, were our guardian angels. They'd report 40 bombers heading your way or destroyer squadron moving south at high speed. Many times their warnings saved our bases from surprise attack or helped us position for perfect ambush. We never met most of them, but we owed them our lives. One technological advancement that revolutionized PT boat operations was radar. The first sets were so primitive they could barely distinguish between an island and a ship. But by late 1944, we could track targets in complete darkness and fog. The Japanese, who had relied on superior night vision and training, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. We could see them before they could see us. The ultimate advantage in night combat. The evolution of our tactics was constant. We learned to use aluminum foil strips to confuse Japanese radar. We developed wolfpack tactics, coordinating attacks by multiple boats from different directions. We figured out how to use shore batteries as diversions, getting the enemy to reveal their positions by firing at fake targets while we maneuvered for the real attack. The most dangerous missions were the ones nobody heard about: inserting coast watchers behind enemy lines, evacuating trapped Marines from surrounded beaches, running ammunition to isolated outposts under enemy fire. These weren't glamorous torpedo attacks, but grinding, dangerous work that saved countless lives. We became the Navy's Swiss Army knife, used for any job too dangerous or too crazy for conventional vessels. Personal relationships on PT boats were unique in the military. On a destroyer with 300 men, you might not know everyone's name. On a PT boat with 12 men, you knew everything. Who snored, who had nightmares, who got seasick, who could be counted on when things went to hell. That intimacy created bonds that lasted lifetimes. My PT boat reunions decades after the war felt like family gatherings because that's what we were, a family forged in combat. The food on PT boats deserves its own mention or perhaps complaint. We lived on crations, spam, powdered eggs, and whatever we could trade from larger ships. Fresh water was precious ration for drinking only. We washed in sea-ater, which left salt crystals that chafed and burned. Coffee, black and strong enough to float a wrench, was our lifeblood. Some crews became creative fishing with hand grenades or trading torpedo alcohol to base personnel for real food. Maintenance was constant and critical. Salt water corroded everything. Tropical heat rotted wood and fabric, and high-speed operations stressed every component to its limits. We spent more time maintaining our boats than fighting in them. Every man became a mechanic, carpenter, and electrician by necessity. A PT boat with engine failure in enemy waters was a death trap, so we treated maintenance like a religion. The weather in the Solomons was our constant enemy. Tropical squalls could appear from nowhere, turning calm seas into mountains of water. Lightning strikes could fry our radios and electrical systems. The heat and humidity were so oppressive that men would pass out at their posts. But bad weather was also our friend, hiding us from enemy aircraft and making our small boats harder to spot among the wind-driven waves. Navigation in those waters required skills they never taught at Annapolis. Charts were often wrong based on surveys from the 1800s. Coral reefs could appear overnight after storms. We learned to read watercolor and wave patterns to smell land before seeing it, to navigate by instinct when instruments failed. Every successful patrol added to our mental maps of those deadly waters. The Japanese response to PT boats evolved throughout the war. They developed special shallow draft destroyers specifically to hunt us. They created coordinated search patterns using float planes and destroyers together. They even tried using captured PT boats as decoys. But for every countermeasure they developed, we developed countermeasures. It became a deadly game of chess played at 40 knots in the dark. One aspect rarely discussed was the psychological toll, living constantly on edge, knowing that any patrol could be your last, watching friends die in horrific ways. It marked us all. Some men cracked requesting transfers even though it meant being labeled cowards. Others became addicted to the adrenaline, volunteering for increasingly dangerous missions. Most of us just endured, finding ways to cope with fear that never really went away. The humor that developed was dark but necessary. We named our boats things like Sudden Death Hell's Angels and Grim Reaper. We painted cartoon characters on our torpedoes. Donald Duck riding a torpedo was popular. We made up songs about sinking Japanese ships. The more gruesome, the better. It was psychological armor, a way to make the unbearable bearable. The impact of PT boats extended beyond the Pacific. When the Normandy invasion was planned, PT boats were included to protect the fleet from German boats. The lessons learned in the Solomons were applied in the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and even the rivers of Europe. American PT boat doctrine influenced naval thinking worldwide, inspiring similar programs in dozens of navies. Looking back now, decades later, I'm amazed we survived. We were mostly kids playing with deadly toys in a war that killed millions. We made mistakes that should have killed us, took risks that make me shudder in retrospect. But we also accomplished something remarkable. We took an untested concept and turned it into a war-winning weapon. We proved that American innovation and courage could overcome any obstacle. The legacy of PT boats lives on in today's Navy. Every fast attack craft, every special operations boat, every vessel designed to strike quickly and disappear carries the DNA of those original mosquito boats. The sailors who crew them probably don't know about nights off Vela La Vela or the terror we brought to Japanese convoys, but there are spiritual descendants carrying on the tradition of speed, surprise, and audacity. When people ask me if I'm proud of my service, I tell them about that night of July 20th, 1943. 3 small wooden boats attacked a major enemy convoy and sent thousands of Japanese soldiers to the bottom. We emerged from darkness just as our title suggests and disappeared before the enemy could respond. We were America's secret weapon, and we changed the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese were stunned not just by our boats, but by what they represented. American willingness to innovate, to take risks, to challenge conventional wisdom. They had studied our Navy for decades, knew our battleships and carriers, our traditions and tactics. But they never imagined we'd send wooden speedboats armed with torpedoes to challenge their steel warships. That failure of imagination cost them dearly. In the end, the story of PT boats is a uniquely American story. We took a British concept, powered it with packed engines designed for aircraft, armed it with torpedoes originally designed for destroyers, and crewed it with civilians who'd never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor. It shouldn't have worked, but it did because we made it work through sheer determination and ingenuity. The last operational PT boat was retired in 1959, replaced by newer, faster, more capable vessels. But for those of us who served on them in World War II, they'll always be the boats that won the war in the Pacific. We proved that size doesn't determine victory, that courage matters more than armor, and that American sailors in wooden boats could defeat anyone, anywhere, anytime. As I finished this account, sitting in my study, surrounded by faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, I can still hear those Packard engines roaring in the night. I can still feel the spray of Solomon's seawater on my face, still smell the cordite and diesel fumes. Most of all, I can still feel the pride of being part of something revolutionary, something that changed naval warfare forever. We were boys who became men in those wooden boats, fighting a war we didn't start but were determined to finish. We attacked from darkness because that's where we were strongest, where our speed and surprise gave us the advantage. The Japanese learned to fear the darkness they once owned, learned that American ingenuity could turn any disadvantage into an advantage. That's the legacy of PT boats. Not just the ships we sank or the battles we won, but the proof that free people fighting for their freedom can overcome any tyranny. We were small, fast, and deadly. We were secret weapons that stayed secret just long enough to turn the tide. We were the mosquito fleet that brought down an empire one torpedo at a time. The Japanese were stunned by America's secret PT boats because they represented everything the Imperial Navy hadn't expected from Americans: innovative thinking, aggressive tactics, and the willingness to risk everything on an unproven concept. By the time they understood the threat we posed, it was too late. The shadows they had once ruled now belonged to us, and from those shadows we struck without mercy until the rising sun finally set on Japan's Pacific Empire.